Hello again, and welcome to Back Then,
Right now.
where we talk about how things were back then and why they matter right now. And this is going to be a great episode. Really, I promise. I swear it on my title as a minister in the name of the great city of Dallas, Texas. Cross my heart and hope to die. Stick a needle in my eye.
Very nice.
Thank you. But really, while Jesus' teaching on oaths may seem straightforward, its implications are deep and wide. From pinky promises we made as kids to wording an email just right so you don't have to make a hard, fast commitment, being a people who just let their yes be yes and no be no is challenging.
And it was no less challenging back in Jesus' day. The world of oaths and vows in the ancient world was diverse, complex, and had exceptionally high stakes. And it wasn't just for the Jewish people who made up the majority, if not all of, Jesus' audience.
It's important to remember that the world that Jesus occupied was profoundly multicultural. Jesus' world was rooted in Jewish tradition and scripture, ruled by the Roman Empire and steeped in Hellenistic culture, from societal norms to religious practices. And all these different cultures have their own ways and reasons for making and upholding oaths. Sometimes it was a legal thing, sometimes a religious thing, but sometimes just a social thing. Either way, there was a lot to navigate and consider.
So let's narrow it down a little bit. One example is the Roman idea of sacramentum. That probably sounds familiar since it is where we get the word sacrament. Often sacramentum referred to a military oath that soldiers would take when they enlisted, swearing their allegiance to the Roman consul or emperor. A key part of this, though, was that sacramentum wasn't just about giving your word. It went one step further. To swear something sacramentum was to make it sacred, which meant sacred, or more specifically, that it was given to the gods. The thing is, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. On one hand, something or someone, sacred, was set apart, consecrated, or committed to the gods. It's invoking the highest, most revered authority. But on the other hand, that also meant that if the sacramentum was broken, like if a soldier deserted or mutinied or otherwise violated that pledge of allegiance to Rome, they were given to the gods in the negative sense. Sure, they'd suffer punishment by their officers as well, but ultimately it carried the same tone as, may God have mercy on your soul. If you break that oath, you will have to answer and be accountable to the highest divine authority. And at that point, well, good luck, sport. There's a similar sort of sentiment even present in the Hebrew Bible when discussing covenants. When two people made a covenant, there was this practice of cutting a sacrificial animal in half, and the parties entering into the covenant would walk between the two halves as if to say, if I should break this covenant, let what has happened to this animal happen to me, which pretty intense.
So there was obviously a lot of pressure from all directions to uphold the oaths you make. And with stakes so high, it's no wonder that people's attention started to draw toward the way you make an oath. Here might be a good place to mention that the Greek noun Jesus uses for oath, horkos, is noted as being akin to another Greek word, erkos, which means a fence or enclosure. Think about the imagery for a second. Oaths are by nature binding, so it seems natural that people would try to make oaths in a way that would allow a bit more wiggle room, a way to unlatch the fence, maybe even provide an escape route should they really need it.
But there's another deeper reason that Jesus is able to give all these examples of ways not to make an oath. For one, oaths became the language of the marketplace, the typical interaction, exchanges, and transactions between people, which could get tricky because in these cases, people didn't really feel bound to keep their oaths because of anything other than their own conscience. There was no agreed upon way to swear an oath that was inherently binding, or rather, there were perhaps too many. That's because Jewish religious officials by this time had set to work trying to devise formulas for how to best swear an oath. Think a Mad Lib or form letter where you would begin and end an oath with some key phrases. I, first name, agree to, thing you're swearing to, by heaven, or something like that. But why? It actually tracks all the way back to Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, with God's command to not misuse God's name, or as it's often translated, not taking God's name in vain. Now that command doesn't explicitly refer to swearing oaths of any kind, but by the time that Jesus comes around, the implementation of that command had developed to the point that the question of misusing God's name became a question of how to swear oaths. This was because Jewish folks knew that taking the Lord's name in vain wasn't about avoiding saying things like, oh my God, but rather not invoking the name of God fraudulently or applying God's name to actions which are actually counter to God's way and nature. Plus, we've got verses like Deuteronomy 6:13 and 10:20 that specifically seem to say that we should swear by God. So, religious leaders tried to devise these formulas of oath-taking so as to uphold the integrity of God's name because it seemed that an oath improperly taken might profane the name of God. Profanum, by the way, being the opposite of sacer. So, those examples Jesus gives were likely things people had heard before because, again, the stakes were pretty high when it came to oaths, and they were paying attention.
And that's part of what made Jesus' approach so radical. He doesn't paint God as the punisher of those who break their oaths. In fact, he doesn't even portray the evil one as the punisher of people who don't honor their oaths. Instead, he only mentions the evil one when describing the ways not to make an oath. In a way, Jesus might be de-escalating the high stakes and anxiety around breaking oaths to reveal what's really important. You're not going to stumble out of God's grace and security by the oaths you take or break. Yet, he calls people to the way of oath-making and truth-telling that may even be more challenging. Jesus puts our fears to rest and calls us to the higher way at the same time.
And that's a glimpse into how things were back then. Right now, we want to hear from you. What keeps you from committing to a simple yes or no? And what loopholes do you make for yourself? Is it difficult to extend grace to others when they let you down? And how about to yourself?
Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you next time on Back Then,
Right Now.